Welcome to the Modise Network. The leaked emails detailing Cyril Ramaphosa's fundraising for the 2017 election to the ANC presidency became the center of a political storm recently, raising questions about the influence that money interests may have on the country's leadership. The emails, called the Ramaphosa leaks, are allegedly part of the evidence presented to the public protector Mcebisi. In an earlier matter, Advocate Mcebisi had ordered President Cyril Ramaphosa to take disciplinary action against Minister Prof and for himself as president to be investigated by the National Prosecuting Authority for money laundering. The opposition parties, the EFF in particular, had been critical of the president, whilst other parties were calling for the public protector to be investigated by Parliament. And all these squabbles, confusing as they are, happen at a time when South Africa is at its worst, economically speaking, and also shortly after the elections. In the middle of all this, the Land Reform Review Panel submitted its report to the government, and it's made recommendations about how land restitution should be carried out. The review is the outcome of the call for land to be expropriated from big landowners and to be redistributed to particularly the black community without compensation. The land panel was chaired by Dr. Vuyokazi Mahlati, who will be talking to us later on in the show. We'll also be joined by Constance Mokhali, who is National Coordinator of the Alliance for Rural Democracy. And in a short while, I'll be talking to Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana to make sense of South Africa's murky politics and to ask whether we will be able to manage ourselves out of the economic mess we find ourselves in. And I'm now joined by political analyst Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana, and we would also like you to be part of our conversation through social media. Use the hashtag the Modise Network. And as I've indicated, we're talking about the political developments in the country and the impact that these developments are having on turning the country around. We are in economic trouble, and this is something that we're getting used to living with. Now, Prof, thank you very much for being with me on the show.
Yes, Tim.
We've seen a lot of stuff happen out there in the political arena, and politicians, the public protector, spending so much time in the courts, and the public protector now saying that she's not going to contest President Ramaphosa's appeal against the recommendations that she made against the president, that action be taken against him. What's your take?
Well, that's quite interesting because I would have expected that if she believed in her own report, right, believed that she was correct, then she would defend it. I wonder, though, whether it says that she's no longer convinced that she was right in finding the president wrong, saying the president misled Parliament intentionally and therefore Parliament must sanction him. So it's an interesting turn of events. But it's a small turn. It doesn't magnify, it doesn't mean much because she's still continuing, for instance, with the case against Pravin Gordhan on giving Ivan Pillay early retirement. Something that is insignificant because the practice of giving civil servants early retirement was quite common. A lot of people did it, right? And what is even more odd about this is that she has discretion on deciding whether or not to take a case. She can decide, no, this case is frivolous, I won't take it. So she's not obliged to do so. But she's taken it on, despite several instances of this thing happening. So that indicates a pattern of going against certain individuals who are linked to Cyril Ramaphosa. And this is then amplified, this suspicion is amplified by the other case we're discussing just now, looking into the Bosasa donation and then veering off into other monies that are there, and these are private monies, something that she's not qualified to do. She shouldn't have passed any judgment on that. That is assuming that she even had to investigate the Bosasa thing to start with. So the fact that she passed comment on something that she has no powers to investigate and even referred that to the police suggests malice. There's a pattern to it which suggests malice. It's not just an innocent case of error or incompetence, perhaps incompetence, but also malice.
Now, evidence that she gathered, or the Office of the Public Protector gathered around the donations to President Cyril Ramaphosa when he was running for president of ANC, because these are the things that happened in 2017, has now been put out in the public domain through these so-called Ramaphosa leaks, and generated so much commentary and interest in the public, to the extent that people believe that we were headed for a constitutional crisis and that the president was corrupt, and started asking questions about the types of donors that made their contributions to his campaign to become president of the ANC. What do you make of the fact that, firstly, those emails were leaked, and number two, that they generated the type of comment that we've seen in the public domain?
Well, we should have expected that the emails would be leaked. There's intense rivalry within the ANC, and people are not fighting clean, they're fighting dirty. And that's how ANC battles have gone on over the years. And these battles, in order for one to win, you have had to resort to other means, especially bringing in money to influence races, for instance. And this started, interestingly, way back in 2005, when ANC races were no longer settled by Luthuli House, because Jacob Zuma had been expelled from the ANC and he was contesting for the presidency, so he started mobilizing a groundswell of support against the establishment that was Luthuli House. And so for his campaign to be successful, he had to raise money. That's where you saw the rise of Friends of Jacob Zuma, for instance. So that's the beginning of money and influence of money in ANC politics. So for anyone, if you entertain ambition of being president, you had to raise money. So this is the malfeasance of ANC politics, that they acknowledge that themselves repeatedly. That is something that they have to change. So to assume, therefore, that the president would not have raised money, because this comes out as some kind of a scandal, right? That he's not clean. But you have to contextualize that clean. It would be naive to say you would want to be president of the ANC without engaging in some of the unsavory acts of raising money, influencing. And they admit that it's wrong, but you had to engage in those for your candidature to stand a good chance of succeeding. So that's what it did. But the point is that, do those practices in ANC politics define his character? Do they define who he is? Or are these things that he had to do in order to win the presidency? Then once he has the presidency, he will then use it for noble ends. I think those practices do not define him. That's the game he had to play to win the presidency. Otherwise, he would not have won.
Well, I'll tell you, Prof, I mean, people are saying, this is what happened, or the information they get from the Ramaphosa leaks. They say, oh, now we see that Cyril Ramaphosa is no different from Jacob Zuma. That is the general conclusion. And I've followed what people are saying and read some of the editorials, and including, the political parties, the EFF in particular, saying, you see, there's your Cyril Ramaphosa. He's no different from his predecessor.
Well, it's too early. That conclusion is a little bit premature and entirely flawed, especially so early in the game. Because Cyril Ramaphosa has not had 9 years during which the state was looted. And there's evidence of that coming out at the Zondo Commission. What we know about Cyril Ramaphosa is that he did receive money from private donors, something that everyone received who was contesting for the ANC presidency, including Lindiwe Sisulu, most likely, Jeff Radebe, all of them, right? What JZ did was to go ahead and almost bankrupt the state. So there isn't a moral equivalence there. To argue that point is to argue a fundamentally flawed point.
Now, the EFF is calling on Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, to be fired. And then, and that's the link, because they work their way back on the basis of that the president is reluctant to dismiss Pravin Gordhan. They're very set that he must go. I want you to tell me why you think they feel so strongly about this fact. And number two, the link that they form between him having played a role in fundraising and not being dismissed by President Cyril Ramaphosa, because they turn around and say, aha, that's the reason why he cannot fire him. He's at the center of this scandal of collecting money from private individuals and companies. And therefore, on top of that, therefore, the agenda is going to be determined by private sector interests.
The EFF has an old gripe against Pravin. They are following an adage that says, especially in relation to Mcebisi, for instance, that an enemy of my enemy is my friend. Because they started off being opposed to Mcebisi, right, saying she was incompetent. But then when she started probing into Pravin's affairs, they are now defending her. They wanted to get Pravin, mainly because, and Pravin is not entirely innocent in this thing. Earlier, when he was commissioner, he did an odd thing, right, investigating Malema and trying to find out where he had amassed all his wealth, you know, millions and millions of rands, when Malema was not the only one at the time with this inexplicable wealth in your 20s when you have never held down a job, right? There were many other ANC people who were guilty of the same thing that Malema did. But I suspect that Pravin was doing so on the bidding of JZ, right? Because JZ and Malema had a falling out, right? So the idea was to decapitate this fellow. So that was unfair. That's when then they turned enemies. And subsequent to that, we've heard reports of Malema being funded by tobacco smugglers, for instance. So SARS is going not only against Malema, but against people who associate with Malema. So Malema is out to settle scores with Pravin. So that's where this thing comes from. And that's where the unfairness to some degree is somewhat understandable from Malema's side, that Pravin pursued me only when there were multiple ANC people who had also unexplained wealth, and yet he pursued Malema. So that's where the gripe is. But the case that they want to get his head on has no grounds. You know, the pension thing will not stick because it was a normal practice, right? So they'll have to find something else to hit Pravin with, but the Ivan Pillay thing will not stick.
You know, you teach politics, and South Africans are trying to make sense of the politics at this time, right? Post-elections. One would have thought that would have a sort of honeymoon period of sorts, 100 days, whatever, 3-4 months, and then we'll find our way, we'll begin to make sense of where we're headed to as a country. How would you describe what is going on at this time? And I'm asking from the point of view of an average South African who thinks, we voted and we're waiting for things to work, but there's so much sniping and court appearances, attacks on each other. How should South Africans make sense of these developments?
I think it's natural for people to have had huge expectations of what would happen following Cyril Ramaphosa's inauguration, because a lot had happened that people wanted to put behind them, to clean up, really. I think there was a lot of depression in the country. So they then expect instant changes, especially when you hear that parastatals are collapsing, monies have been stolen. So you are looking for recovery of money and people to be prosecuted. But those things take time. And with a delay, naturally people would be disappointed. But what they need to understand is that those who stand a lot to lose, those who are implicated, are going to fight back, Tim. These are people who've been living a life of luxury based on stolen money, right? You can't be eating sushi today, hanging out in Sandton, and the next day you wake up in prison. No one wants to go to prison. So this is a fight back, and it's going to go on for a while. So it is for the president and the leadership to reassure the public that we are doing something. But make sure that you deliver something in the interim, not wait for the Zondo Commission, for instance, to deliver a bombshell report. But there must be something in the interim showing that the new dawn agenda is beginning to deliver, that today is different from yesterday. If today remains the same as yesterday, then you don't inspire confidence, right? So they've got to do something, but it's going to be tough.
Professor Mcebisi Ndletyana is my guest, and we're discussing developments in the country, and we were looking largely at the political situation at this time, and particularly as it affects President Cyril Ramaphosa. But is the president able to act in a positive direction to get the country on the right path? Because economically speaking, we are in trouble, and we'll be looking at some of the issues confronting this nation on the economic front with Professor Ndletyana when we return.